very warm welcome for those of you who have just come for today's Battle of Ideas Festival. Particularly pleased to be starting the keynote controversies section of today's Battle of Ideas with this very important discussion: are patriotism and the nation state back? At the start of the blurb for this session starts with a quote, Jean-Claude Juncker from 2019, that say, "The populist, nationalist, stupid nationalists, they are in love with their own countries." And it was said with such a sneer, right? Until recently, that sentiment of a top-down cultural crusade against nationalism, the idea of the ideology of globalization and the dominance of transnational institutions, did make sovereignty and patriotism look as though it was dead on the way out. Well, something's definitely changed. We've got MAGA in the US, we've got Operation Raise the Colours. I had a very brief moment of being a member of the European Parliament. And when we were leaving the European Parliament, all of the MEPs from the Brexit Party, and I was one of those, waved little Union Jacks. Now, I have to say, I was sitting at the back waving it rather timidly. So I'm being honest, right? And there was photographs of that. And as the MEPs from the Brexit Party waved their Union Jacks, the Lib Dems jeered and booed, the British Lib Dems. At the end of this year's Lib Dem conference, they all gathered together for a photo shoot in which they all enthusiastically waved Union Jacks. We've had Yvette Cooper, when she was the Home Secretary, who tells us that they've got Union Jacks all over their house. They've got Union Jack buntings and Union Jack tablecloth. I personally think that's very odd. I mean, that is, what kind of a home has Union Jack tablecloths? Anyway, that's my view. But what I'm trying to say is something's going on. But also with this sort of re-emergence of patriotism, I'm going to shut up in a minute, there are tensions, because we can say nationalism's back and the national interest and so on and so forth. But we know alongside that there are some trends towards a kind of ethno-nationalism, people turning the nationalism issue into a "are you really English" question. And that's an underlying tension of this debate, which may or may not come up, but I don't want to pretend it's not there. I also think, however, that the demonization of patriotism carries on, and we do know, ex-footballers are saying that they're, seeing Union Jacks and pulling them down. There's all this sort of stuff going on. So the flag wars are happening. So that's what we're here to discuss. And I can't tell you what a great panel we've got. Right, it's a real genuine treat to have Professor Robert Toombs. I had to persuade him to interrupt a family event to speak, but my goodness, I was delighted when he said yes, because when we were conceiving of this event, he was the man I had in mind as somebody I wanted to speak on it, because I knew that he had been thinking about this and writing, and there have been reasons why he was writing about it brilliantly, and he helped influence me to think we should do it. So he's here. He's Emeritus Professor of French History from Cambridge, co-editor of History Reclaimed. He's the author of This Sovereign Isle, Britain in and Out. Britain in and Out. Oh God, I don't know what it's called now. Right. But the main thing is he's here. Give him a warm welcome. I'm sorry, Robert. We then got Dr. Rakib Ehsan, who is the author of Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. He's an honorary senior fellow at the University of Buckingham. And Rakib is a prolific writer and broadcaster on every issue that is controversial around race or nationality or patriotism or any of these things. Rakib can be relied to be the voice of common sense, calm, rational, fearless, courageous. I'm delighted he's on the panel. Give him a warm welcome. We then have Ada Akpala, who is a writer and commentator on the complex narratives of race and identity in modern society. She is head of content at the Equiano project. Ada has been a very important voice at the Equiano project, and the Equiano project is a very important and increasingly influential, I think, voice on having a rational, non-identity politics-based intervention on race. And so we're absolutely thrilled to have you here. Can we give Ada a warm welcome? We've then got Bruno Waterfield, who is the Brussels correspondent of The Times. He's been reporting and commenting on European affairs for over 25 years. He's a great friend of the Battle of Ideas Festival. We often ask him if he'll chair events, which he's very accomplished. He's always got interesting things to say. Obviously, because of his role in terms of being a correspondent in relation to Europe, he's had to think about the issue of sovereignty and nationalism for some time. And also, he's a little bit of a George Orwell secret scholar as well, which is relevant to any discussion on patriotism as far as I'm concerned. Can we give Bruno a warm welcome? And last but definitely not least, we've got Eric Kaufmann. Professor Kaufmann is Professor of Politics at Buckingham University. He's the convener of a new online course, Woke: The Origins, Dynamics and Implications of an Elite Ideology. And his most recent book is Taboo: How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution. Again, Eric Kaufmann was one of the people who there was an attempt at cancelling in academia, refused to be cancelled. In fact, he doubled down and became a very important voice in relation to academic freedom and basically fighting the good fight. So we're always delighted to have him. Eric Kaufmann. Right. Fabulous panel. So, Robert, can you kick us off, please? Thanks.
Oh, well, thanks very much, Claire, for that very flattering and quite unjustified introduction. Are patriotism and the nation state back, is our question. I hope so, but I'm not optimistic, at least not about this country in the short term. But I'd be very happy if you all prove me wrong. A recent piece by the always thought-provoking writer Mary Harrington made me sit up. She says that amateur team sports are declining, while individualistic endurance sports, running, timing yourself, all that, are booming. And she sees this as a symbol of a wider and fundamental change in politics and society, from the team, the nation, the community, to the atomized, mobile individual, linked only digitally. I suppose this takes us back once again to David Goodhart's insight into somewhere and anywhere people. The biggest somewhere is the nation, but it's mostly run today by anywhere people. So are patriotism and the nation on the wrong side of history? Are they doomed by sea changes in society and culture that we are powerless to stop? If they are, we're facing a continuing waning of democracy, a disastrous undermining of solidarity, a visible decline of mutual trust, and a corresponding increase in tribalism and conflict. We see this happening already every day. Violence, cheating, thieving, corruption. Democracy is rooted in the idea and reality of the nation. All power comes from the nation, proclaimed the French Revolution. That is to say, it doesn't come from the king, the aristocracy, or the priests, or their modern-day avatars. But as Roger Scruton pointed out, there can be no democracy without a demos, a we united by a shared sense of belonging. Much of our elite doesn't seem to like this. Whether as a general idea, patriotism, or as a specific reality, Britain. They like the EU, the great bureaucratic anti-nation. They try hard to destroy patriotism, a sense of belonging to a national community and owing loyalty to it. Remember the outcry when when Theresa May talked about being citizens of nowhere, or when our present Prime Minister talked about the danger of being an island of strangers, a phrase, of course, that he quickly withdrew and said he hadn't read the speech before he gave it. I'm a historian, and I'm sensitive to the centrality of what the 19th century French philosopher Ernest Renan called a rich legacy of memories, which he said led to a present desire to live together. That, he said, is what creates a democratic nation and lets it survive. But many, perhaps most of our institutions, universities, museums, schools, even the Church of England, want to replace a historical culture that might unite us with a culture that can only divide us. Like parasites, they weaken the body that sustains them, for they all depend on public funds. They're not seeking a more accurate or more sensitive understanding of our past, despite what they might say. They seem to want only a divisive and destructive version, and they cling to that even when they're shown that it's false or distorted. I could give many examples, and we might come to that later, but one thing that always comes back to me is the Church of England's project of giving away £100 million in reparations because they said they were sitting on a historic pool of tainted capital derived from the slave trade. When it was shown to them that this money did not come from the slave trade, they didn't say, "Oh gosh, that's a relief." What they said was, "You're racists, and we're going to do it anyway. We'll think of some other reasons." The ultimate meaning of reparations is to say that nothing you have, materially or culturally, is rightfully yours. Everything you have is based on theft and violence. So be ashamed, be resentful, reject your country, and disown your predecessors. That is why the demands for huge reparations, which would otherwise be simply absurd, have to be thoroughly contested and rejected. But this is the way that the attitude scorned by George Orwell in 1940 is spread. He wrote, "England is the only great country whose intellectuals are ashamed of their own nationality." And he pointed out that during the 1930s they had been chipping away at English morale in the face of the Nazi threat. Even the war didn't really stop them. Today's successors are chipping away even more, even in the face of new dangers. Unless they can be stopped from exercising a completely disproportionate, effectively unaccountable, and I would say illegitimate influence inside our institutions, patriotism and the nation will not be back, unless perhaps as a popular rebellion of the sort that we may be seeing, and which I imagine many people in this hall are hoping will have its effect.
Thank you very much, Robert. Can I now have Rakib, your thoughts, please?
I just think, just to follow on Robert's points about the slavery reparations, I think Lenny Henry's demand for the UK to pay £18 trillion in slavery reparations was very much in keeping with his comedy background, put it that way. But firstly, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this session. It's great to see so many familiar faces, in particular. I think the question of is patriotism back? Is nation-state politics back? I think in some ways it never went. It never disappeared, the patriotism. I think what we did see for a long time were these models of sanctioned patriotism or permissible patriotism, where you had what I'd consider to be a progressive liberal political establishment, but just not in politics, but in other spheres of British life, especially the media, where certain forms of patriotism, or rather certain shapes of patriotic expressions, they were seen as more palatable. And I think that that's something to be said about the kind of culture which is developed, and the fact that now what we are seeing is we are seeing a counter challenge to that, a cultural counter challenge, in the shape of what I'd consider to be a quiet English revolution, I'd say. And I think that just to look at why we are seeing that now, and why I think a large chunk of the population, especially in England, are just genuinely fed up, is because it's something that Professor Kaufmann, Eric, who actually co-examined my PhD thesis, he's talked about he's talked about a great deal. In this country, we don't really have multiculturalism. What we have is this sort of asymmetrical model of multiculturalism, where you have ethnic minorities, if they express pride in their national heritage, their ancestral origins, and indeed their religious affiliation, non-Christian religious affiliation, this is celebrated. This is promoted across a variety of public institutions, while we've not necessarily seen that enthusiasm in terms of promoting and celebrating British identity within those institutions, but specifically English identity. I think there's been that squeamishness for some time. And I think that doesn't necessarily relate to Scottish identity or Welsh identity even. I think that in some ways the progressive liberals are far more comfortable in terms of promoting those specific types of patriotism in those respective home nations. And I think what we have to say that England is quite different to Scotland and Wales. The reality is that the vast majority, and England is by far the largest populated home nation. But if you're looking at those forms of ethnic, racial and religious diversification, it's specific parts of England, especially the inner cities, but also a number of post-industrial towns, which have really witnessed those processes of, in some cases, massive demographic change. And I think for some time, I'm glad that now, in a way, that the Overton window on these matters of immigration, integration, identity, it has shifted. And I think it's important that you have to talk about, how cultural demographic change, how some people may feel anxious about it. And I don't think that's necessarily rooted in racism and xenophobia. I think in some ways that's a very natural response. And I don't think that when you look at progressive liberal celebrities such as Gary Neville, for example, who I admired a lot, 85 international caps, a fantastic right back for England. But I thought his reaction to the synagogue attack, the Islamist terrorist attack in Manchester, was so revealing. He started talking about angry, middle-aged, I believe he even used the term white men. And I just thought, this is a remarkable response. And he's just so boastful of the idea that he tore down the national flag on one of his construction sites. And I think that what's really problematic here is that there are some cases where people are just avoiding the obvious to actually what are the greatest threats to our, so if you call it modern, multi-ethnic nation, which quite often, now of course, I'm not trivializing the threat of far-right ethno-nationalism, absolutely not. But one of the gravest threat, the most significant threat, is in the form of Islamist extremism. If you're talking about the threat to freedom of expression in particular, which is a very classic liberal democratic freedom that we enjoy in England, well, we should enjoy in England. And I think that what we have to do, we have to have a very honest debate about what are threatening those sort of the traditions, the heritage, and indeed the history of England in particular. And I think I've been asked a great deal about Operation Raise the Colours, how some people find it hugely provocative, they find it intimidating. And I can tell you now, I grew up in Luton, where the English Defence League was created shortly after the Butchers of Basra Islamist demonstrations. And I think that the reality is that if you find the Union flag or indeed the St. George's Cross intimidating, I don't think that the answer to that is removing the flags from the public domain. I think it's more about reevaluating your relationship with those flags. I think that's an important point to make. And I think just without being too self-indulgent, I'll just talk about my own patriotism. That for me, I think too far there's been this culture of almost self-doubt, self-flagellation, which we need to do away with. That we really do. We have to put an end to that. Because I think if I'll talk about this golden package, that, being a member of a racial, ethnic and religious minority, if you talk about this golden package of economic opportunities, religious freedoms, political rights, legal protections and general social stability, I don't think there's any other place that I'd rather live than here. That's the truth of it. And I think that it would be nice if I saw more ethnic minority politicians actually dig into why they are actually patriotic. Yeah, and I think that would be a very compelling argument to make. So I think overall, it is patriotism back. I don't think it really left. I think that people are becoming more assertive now in terms of expressing their patriotism. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. And I think we do need to have a greater focus on the nation state, because I think where we're in at the moment is almost this sense of sort of post-national governance. I think that we have a government, and to admit one of my many sins, my natural party is the Labour Party. If you look at my voting record, I've traditionally voted Labour. But it's almost like it's almost a sense that national security doesn't even exist under this government. They don't even have an understanding that the national security is actually something that you should prioritise in the government agenda. So I would just wrap up very quickly. I'm developing this concept where you have sort of 5 fundamentals. I think it's a good starting point where we can really shore up our sort of, our multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multi-racial society, whatever you want to call it, really. And I think one thing, there has to be a foundational belief that Britain has done more good than harm in the world. I think we had this debate, Rob already touched upon it, about slavery. I think quite often a lot of the discussions I've seen on it have been hugely skewed. I think there's very little talk about the sacrifice that the Royal Navy's West Africa Squadron made, for example, in terms of patrolling waters. And they still do that in a tribute to the West Africa Squadron at a great cost as well, because the reality, if people have even a decent understanding of it, is that the slave ships were vastly more sophisticated and well equipped. So there was a significant economic and human cost to the Royal Navy. Now, there's no avoiding the matter of immigration here. And I think that if you want to have a diverse society which is stable and secure, you need to have an immigration system which is defined by quality and quantity control. At the moment, we have neither. That's the truth of it. And I also think that we need to do away with these sort of American-inspired narratives of England being a land of immigrants. England is certainly not a land of immigrants in the same way the United States is, and I'm very surprised how that's so deeply rooted in some institutions. I think also in terms of looking at the nation state, I think in terms of naturalization and citizenship, I think that should be a lot tougher, those pathways. And I think that they should be heavily reliant on character testimonies from respected members of local communities that don't belong to the same ethnic and religious background of the applicant. I think there needs to be genuine proof of genuine and meaningful integration before you are naturalized. I'd also say that, and there's something that there's no surprise that people who are very familiar with my work would know that I'm fairly socially conservative, and I think it's something that Robert touched upon. I think that we have a tradition of historic individualism. Now, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that personal freedom is something that we should be proud of. But I think that the governments and many public institutions, when they're making key decisions, I think they need to bear in mind the impact it will have on families. I think that for me, from a more traditionalist perspective, I think that if you really want to go on that sort of process of national healing, if you want to call it that, I think we need to put the family at the heart of key decisions. For me, it's the fundamental unit of analysis. And last but not least, I'll make this very final point. In terms of the nation state, I think that there has to be rooted in the idea that you have robust border security. At the moment, we do not have that at all. That's at the core of being a nation state. I'll make this very final point that if you care about the welfare state, you care about its sustainability, that ultimately rests on a degree of demographic stability and having a stable population. And I will leave that there.
Thank you very much. So, Ada, your thoughts, please.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I think patriotism is having its revival at the moment. It's undergoing its much needed revival, in my opinion. And like Rakib mentioned, I don't think it ever disappeared. I think it simply became quieter, maybe a bit more private, not the explicit sort of loud expressions that we are seeing now, more of now. So Michael Billig called it the banal patriotism. So the unnoticed, subtle ways that people affirm belonging and pride, speech codes, certain behaviors, and so on. And the thing is, you didn't really need to think about or talk about or analyze something that you felt was just a part of you, a part of life. It's like oxygen. You don't consciously breathe, you just do it. But of course, if you feel that your oxygen or your ability to breathe is being taken away, then that's when you start to realize how vital it is. And that's why we're having these discussions and seeing a little bit more expression of patriotism. And I do think patriotism works just like oxygen. It gives life to the body politic. It inspires sacrifice, care, attention, and not just in the, big grand ways, but in just very little ways as well. And now your ability to breathe, as we all know, can be hindered in three main ways. First, by neglect, either by, lack of exercise, smoking. I vape myself, so no shade to anyone. Or by external factors, pollution, for example, in the air. Or it can be by maybe bad luck or circumstance. You find yourself maybe attacked. Someone is trying to basically take your breath away, not in the nice romantic way. And I think the same thing has happened with patriotism, and that's why it looks like it went away. There was a gradual weakening of it and a national spirit and national identity, first through neglect. People grew comfortable, I believe. People grew complacent. We stopped sharing in the stories and the rituals and the myths of origin that once inspired and united us. Memories of glory and trauma, heroes, holy places. Common language. I know English is obviously still the common language, but you can see that 1 million people in this country don't speak English well, for example, and that might be rising. This is an issue. And now, in terms of the commonality of sharing stories, it's easy to put the blame on schools, as we usually do. But there was also a lack and a loss of intergenerational storytelling. And again, it was because of the idea that maybe these things are quite self-sustaining. But I think family life became different, a little bit more individualized as well. Family life became fragmented. Parents worked longer hours, grandparents lived further away, or grandkids moved further away. Let's blame the kids. But things became different. And that sense of passing on that continuity and sharedness in stories change. And then secondly, you have external factors, the pollutants, I call it, that make it difficult for ordinary people to feel connected to their country, to their home. We know of these toxins: globalization, mass migration, supranational governance, deindustrialization. It all eroded that sense of we. When those industries disappeared in the 80s, people lost more than jobs. They lost that shared economic identity. We build together, we share together, we labor together being the key word. And finally, you have suffocation, the deliberate cultural and institutional disdain for national pride among sections of the elite. Universities, we see it, newsrooms, cultural institutions. Patriotism has been recast as something unsophisticated and morally suspect. In spite of all this, or probably because of all this, the people are resolved to fight back, whether that's by hanging the flags on lampposts, looking to political parties who promise to take back control. The people are reclaiming what they felt was once instinctive, the right to feel pride in their country without apology. I guess where I am now, what my issue might be, is who are the people expressing this love for country and a desire for sovereignty. I'm a patriot, like Rakib also mentioned about himself, but I think sadly it is still culturally coded as being white and right. Right as in politically speaking, obviously. And I don't mean to racialize these things, but there is still an issue that we need to talk about for the sake of the future of this nation. I would like to see more ethnic minorities from all sides of the political spectrum who call this place home and want the best of it to also be a visible part of this revival. Because too often I think the debate assumes that minorities stand outside of patriotism. National pride excludes us or should exclude us. And it's interesting because polls show that we're actually very patriotic. We are probably more patriotic than a lot of white Britons, right? So where are we? This annoying and persistent idea that patriotism offends us is not grounded in much reality. It's an invention, I think, of the elites who are uneasy with national pride and are trying to keep the divisions alive using our name. Historically, ethnic minority patriotism is nothing new. Among the empire, millions saw Britain as the mother country. Rightly or wrongly, that's another debate, but that's how they saw it. During the world wars, men and women from across the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, they volunteered not out of compulsion, not because we are unwilling agents, but because of conviction. As a RAF veteran once put it, his name was Noel Brown, the king was our king, the flag was our flag. They knew that the Britain they fought for was imperfect, but they believed in its ideals. After the war, they answered the call again, not to fight, but to rebuild. The Windrush generation came to be part of Britain's story. Their patriotism was quiet, but it was steadfast. Of course, that early loyalty, it was tested. They faced discrimination, but they didn't respond with bitterness. They pooled resources, started social clubs, created support networks. In other words, in my view, they did what true patriots do. They took responsibility for where they were, and they worked to make it home. But something more corrosive happened. In the 70s, you had a generation of elites, you had post-colonial guilt, who at that time were fighting to expose racism, inequality, maybe Britain's imperial rights, blind spots. So justified at that time, sure. But over time, that critique hardened into a single story, one told almost entirely through language of oppression and moral debt. And then we had multiculturalism from the 90s. That didn't help. Integration, an ideal model, was about adapting and adjusting. But multiculturalism began to isolate us, to idolize differences. In fact, the more distant you were from the national culture, it seemed that the more moral you were, the more authentic you were. Where are we now? These issues I mentioned, they still persist. The cultural tensions we face seem insurmountable, but that's why I think that this steady revival of patriotism, of the nation state, is a necessity and an opportunity. It's not a threat. If we can strip it from its partisan and politicized and racial coding, and this is where good leadership and purposeful leadership is vital, this can once again form the foundation of a shared national purpose. And I will leave it there.
Bruno.
I'm an expat, so I don't live in Britain. So if I get a bit soppy, sort of hurl things at me or something. For the vast majority of us, patriotism it's innate. On the whole, we don't really need to think about it. It's part of the warp and the weft of everyday life. It's really, on the whole, just not an issue. It's just not a thing. I'm going to just very quick quote.
Right, make sure you speak into the microphone, Bruno. If you're
very quick quote. George Orwell, Lion and the Unicorn, sublime essay, a pamphlet, essentially, probably the best thing that's ever been written about the character of English or British patriotism. And he says that this sort of culture, it's somehow bound up with solid breakfasts and gloomy Sundays, smoky towns and winding roads, green fields and red pillar boxes. It has a flavour of its own. Moreover, it's continuous. It stretches into the future and the past. There is something in it that persists, as in a living creature. And above all, it's your civilization. It's you. However much you hate it or laugh at it, you'll never be happy away from it. To be away from it for any length of time. The suet puddings and the red pillar boxes have entered into your soul. Good or evil, it's yours. You belong to it. And this side of the grave, you will never get away from the marks it has given you. Now, isn't that, it's beautiful, but it's a truth. That is the truth. I mean, that is what patriotism, that's what patriotism is. And what's really changed, and this is it's a really, really major shift. What is going on at the moment is an attempt to essentially eradicate that character, that way in which we live. And I'm going to talk more about that. When Orwell wrote this, he was writing about an external threat. He was writing 1940, 1941, and he begins it as I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead, trying to kill me. He was writing about an external threat
to the very specific traditions and culture of the English British peoples. Now it's an internal. The attempt to eradicate the culture, the everyday lived experience of our lives is coming internally. It's coming from within this country. I just want to talk about flags very, very briefly, because it illustrates something quite profound in the shift. I don't know if anyone ever here watches Last Night at the Proms. I've always found it a bit naff myself, but if you look at photographs of Last Night of a Last Night at the Proms, going back 10 years ago, it's a sea of Union Jacks, the flag of St George. There's the old sort of Welsh dragon and saltire mixed in with there too, but it's an absolute sea of the British flags, and people are waving them, and it's Rule Britannia and all this kind of rather ghastly music from the Victorian imperial era. But you look at the pictures now, and it changed in 2017. It's a sea of blue. They all wave blue flags. Now, the organisers last night at the Proms, they still hang up some Union Jacks on the side of the Royal Albert floor, but the people, they are all waving these blue flags with a sort of circle of gold stars on. Why are they doing that? They're waving that flag because they have an attachment to it, because it's a flag against the people, the British people, who have the gall, the uppityness to vote for Brexit, the greatest popular challenge to the established order for well over a century. This is a really profound. So flags, the meaning isn't in a flag. The meaning is in who waves it, and how the established order now regards Britain's people with contempt. So if a hoi polloi, if you or me want to wave a flag or hang it on a lamppost, that's probably racism, or it's litter, unless it's officially authorised by the great and good. So they still fly the flag at the cenotaph or above a royal palace, and quite right too. So obviously, British people, on the whole, we like a little bit of pomp. We like a little bit of pomp and ceremony. We like a bit of trooping of the colour, but we tend to see it as pomp and ceremony. It's not really patriotism as such. It's the kind of official state rituals and pomp. When we take it up unofficially, autonomously, that is the meaning. It's not the flags that are the problem. It's us. It's when we wave the flag. It's us waving the flag rather than the flags themselves. And this is actually really important, because the essence of English, British patriotism in terms of our democratic, civic and free tradition, which actually goes back centuries, it goes back to at least the English Civil War, is unofficial. It's actually inseparable from us, the British peoples, and how we live. Another nice little bit of George Orwell. All the culture that is most truly native centres around things which, even when they are communal, are not official. The pub, the football match, the back garden, the fireside, the nice cup of tea. It's the liberty to have a home of your own, to do what you like in your spare time, to choose your own amusements instead of having them chosen for you from above. The most hateful of all names in the English ear is Nosy Parker. And that's still, again, a profound truth. The British people, like most peoples in the world, are the best things in our life, the things that really make us, the things that construct us, our foundations that stretch into the past, we hope stretch into the future, are unofficial. And the ethics of the British peoples, which are profoundly secular, although they have distant roots in Christianity, and we have civic traditions going back to Hobbes, Locke, Burke, Paine, the English Civil War, the struggles for universal suffrage in the 19th century. So the ethics of the British have a profound attachment to the freedom of thought, especially freedom of religion, and a very solid belief in keeping force out of politics, of keeping the officials out of our life, because we know that actually the things that really make us are unofficial. In fact, if you think about it, throughout British history, and this is almost unique in the European context, there's never been popular support for fascism or another totalitarian political ideology, such as Stalinism. To the extent it has existed, it has always existed in the power worship of the intelligentsia, who were prone to Stalinism, prone to fascism, and who now embody the sort of multiculturalist, globalist ideology. And unfortunately, they're often at the commanding heights of the state. And one of the most disturbing things about the culture war against the unofficial patriotism and lived life of the English and British peoples is how force has been reintroduced into these unofficial spheres. So when the police come knocking at your door, it's because of the conversations you've been having on a WhatsApp schools group. Schools are very important. It's a place where people come together. It's for generational. It's for the generational continuity. And if you look at the real essence of the culture war against patriotism, it is to reintroduce the question of force, and force is another word for violence, because it can become violence, back into how we conduct our relationships with each other. British patriotism is our love of the unofficial. The British state patriotism can be summed up, is it one word, two words, in the Brit Card app. I'll leave it there.
That's quite a funny end, because I was just thinking about the Brit Card when you were speaking, because I saw a kind of promotion of it with a big Union Jack, and I was thinking apparently that's okay. Union Jack used in a way that's going to create mass surveillance of the citizens of this country. Thank you very much, Bruno. That was really interesting. Okay, so Eric, to finish off, please.
Thanks, Claire. Welcome, everybody. Well, I'm an academic. I've been studying nationalism and researching on it for about 30 years. The question here is the nation state back? And I'm going to do the old media training thing and talk about sort of what I want to talk about, which is actually close, but not the same. Is nationalism back? Because actually, nationalism often tends to arise when the nation state actually is in some way under threat. So the question for me, is nationalism back? I think the answer is yes. And I'm going to focus on the West in particular. I think the reason we're seeing the rise of national populism is actually not because political sovereignty is really under any great threat in Western countries. I don't think it's a political nationalism. It is very much a defensive cultural form of nationalism. That is, cultural identity of nations is under threat. And this is focusing in particular on the issue of immigration. And why immigration is important is because immigration is connected to the quite transformational ethnic and religious changes that are occurring in Western countries. So I'm going to focus on this aspect of the nation. First thing to say, just a few quick things. A place like Britain, it's not just a civic nation. It is also that. It is also about British values and the monarchy and these very inclusive political traditions, although clearly some people would dissent from even those traditions. But it is also about many of the background characteristics we heard from Bruno about, sports and music, the landscape, the history. But in addition to that, also the ethnic and religious composition of the country. Not saying homogeneity, I'm not saying turning clocks back, but the ethnic and religious composition of a country is part of the unofficial texture of the nation. And it matters. The people who say it doesn't matter at all actually are wrong. And in fact, if we want to understand national populism, this is probably the central thing that's going on in all Western countries. The other thing to say is that nations are not singular. There are competing national identities within countries. So I'm from Canada, and our illustrious former Prime Minister, who apparently is going out with Katy Perry, was audacious enough to say Canada has no core culture or identity. Now, what's he doing there? What Trudeau is doing is actually saying, we're the most morally virtuous country on earth. So it's actually a form of moralistic progressive nationalism. That kind of national identity is held by a minority, but often a very influential elite minority in all Western countries, very dominant in elite institutions. Against that, you have a more popular, more ethno-traditional form of nationalism that is more rooted in traditional understandings And again, those unofficial understandings include ethno-religious composition, not to the exclusion of minorities, but the understanding is there's a majority, there's a minority. This has been the tradition. Its erosion or its rapid transformation is causing unease, which is a major driver of national populism. Now, I want to then talk about something which I think is a real impediment to talking about these difficult issues and to actually getting at what is perhaps driving the far right. And that is this issue of what's known as the fallacy of composition. So if you think about it, if I say the NHS isn't working very well and someone says, how can you criticize doctors and nurses? Actually, they're separate things. The NHS is at the aggregate level, at the emergent level. Doctors and nurses are the individual level. Similarly, if I was to say that, there are problems with the military, how can you criticize soldiers? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about a system level, not the individual level of the soldier. Or if I say immigration needs to be reduced, and someone says, how can you be so critical and nasty to immigrants? No, I'm not talking about individual immigrants. I'm talking about immigration as a collective phenomenon. And you're committing what's called the fallacy of composition by trying to reduce it to the immigrant and saying something nasty about an immigrant. Every immigrant could be incredibly virtuous. If we brought 10 million of them in, it would be a disaster. So immigrant and immigration are separate things. And likewise, if we talk about, there's, again, Canada, home of wokery, we have immigration ceremonies where an immigration judge will say, all accents are Canadian accents. Well, that's true at the level of the individual. All individuals, they've got their citizenship, they're all attached to the country, they speak in many different accents. At the level of the individual, it is true that all accents are Canadian accents, all accents are British accents. But at the level of the collectivity, that's a ridiculous statement. There's a Canadian accent, there's a German accent, a Chinese accent, they're separate. And I would say the same thing here about ethnic and religious composition. Rishi Sunak, in my view, is English. Despite his religion, despite his race, that's fine. Anyone of any background can be English. But what about England as a whole? If England transforms to become a majority non-Christian, non-white British society, is it as English as it was? No. In my view, it isn't. That's the collective level. That doesn't mean I'm saying Rishi Sunak is less English than anybody else. We need to be able to distinguish these two things. Now, out of that comes another thing, which is that actually the ethnic and religious composition of the nation is a tradition that belongs not just to white British people who are Protestant. It belongs to Rakib or Ada. It belongs to minorities. And interesting, when we look at opinion surveys, Ada mentioned, in Britain, British Sikhs are as attached to that majority ethnic composition as white British Brexit voters. You can look at Canada, where ethnic minorities are as likely to say that the immigration flow has been disproportionately slanted to non-European sources. They are more likely than white Canadians to say that. In the United States, Hispanic and Asian Trump voters are as likely as white Trump voters to say that the European Christian heritage of America is important and under threat. So what I mean here is that to try and avoid these conversations about immigration and ethnic change, to expect that that's going to be the way to go, I think is a huge problem. We're going to have to address the trap of the fallacy of composition. That now, again, there's going to be this temptation to say that's ethno-nationalism. It is not ethno-nationalism is to say you have to be white to be British. That is rejected by over 90% of British people. However, the idea that the ethnic composition can change rapidly overnight, that doesn't matter, I'm sorry, that's just not right. It is important, and it's not only important to white people, it's important to minorities as well. So I would just here's a plea to actually start to get past that fallacy of composition and to talk about these tricky issues. That's going to require a lot more maturity. It's not going to happen in our elite institutions, but hopefully it can happen somewhere. Otherwise, we're just going to get radicalism on the right, and we're going to get the elites talking about esoteric issues that really are tangential to the questions that are really dividing, I think, Western publics. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. The panel were brilliant. Thank you.